There's a moment that changes everything. For one historian, it happened in Paris in the spring of 1984, in an archive that smelled of old paper and centuries of accumulated silence. The kind of place where dust moves slowly through shafts of afternoon light, where the past isn't just studied but physically present, pressed between sheets of yellowing parchment and bound in cracking leather. His hands were trembling. Not from age, though he'd spent 30 years studying maps, but from something else, something closer to recognition. Or perhaps its opposite, the sudden, unsettling realization that what you thought you knew might be entirely wrong. The map had been misfiled, tucked behind a collection of 18th century maritime charts where it didn't belong. When he unfolded it carefully across the wooden table, the parchment crackled with a sound like distant thunder. It was beautiful in the way. Old maps are beautiful hand-drawn coastlines traced in fading ink, Latin script curling across empty spaces, small illustrations of ships and sea monsters decorating the margins. He recognized Europe immediately. The familiar boot of Italy, the irregular coastline of Iberia, the northern reaches of Scandinavia. Africa stretched southward, its proportions roughly correct for a 16th century rendering. Asia sprawled across the eastern portion of the map, detailed enough to show mountain ranges and river systems. Everything was where it should be. Everything made sense. And then, his eyes moved south. At the bottom of the map, dominating nearly a fifth of the entire surface, lay something massive. A continent. Not sketched tentatively or marked with question marks, but drawn with the same confident certainty as France or England. It had coastlines, interior mountain ranges, rivers flowing toward the sea, regional names written in careful Latin script, now faded to the color of old blood. The problem was simple and absolute. This continent didn't exist. It had never existed. He checked the map's date, 1573. He checked the cartographer's name, recognized it as belonging to one of the era's most respected geographical authorities. He looked back at the continent, half expecting it to have vanished like some optical illusion, but it remained there, vast and impossible, stretching across latitudes where the modern world knows only ocean. This wasn't his first encounter with Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Every serious student of historical cartography knows about it. But knowing about something and confronting it directly are different experiences. On this particular map, the phantom continent looked more real than many actual places, more detailed than parts of Africa that genuinely existed, more confidently rendered than regions of Asia that merchants had been visiting for centuries. The historian sat back in his chair, feeling something shift in his understanding. These weren't primitive people working from legend and guesswork. The cartographer who made this map could calculate longitude, could predict lunar eclipses, could navigate by stars with precision that would be respectable even today. These were the greatest scientific minds of the Renaissance, working with the best information available, cross-referencing reports from multiple explorers, consulting with royal geographers and university scholars. And they'd all agreed. There was a continent in the south. They'd drawn its mountains, named its bays, calculated its size, argued over which European power had the rightful claim to its shores. For 200 years, every expedition that sailed into southern waters went searching for it. Kings invested fortunes trying to find it. Men died in the attempt. Maps were drawn and redrawn, each version adding more detail, more certainty, more evidence of something that would turn out to be nothing more than collective imagination, made manifest in ink and parchment. But if this continent never existed, why does it appear on nearly every map made between 1500 and 1800? The map in Paris wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a pattern so consistent, so widespread, that calling it a mistake feels inadequate. Mistakes are singular events, isolated failures of judgment or execution. What happened with Terra Australis was something else entirely, a consensus hallucination that spanned 3 centuries and crossed every border in Europe. Consider a Portuguese chart from 1502, created just 10 years after Columbus reached the Americas. The New World is barely sketched, a vague outline of coastline with vast blank spaces where knowledge simply doesn't exist yet. But turn the map upside down, look at the southern hemisphere, And there it is, a massive landmass drawn with surprising confidence. The cartographer had never been there. No Portuguese sailor had ever reported seeing it. Yet there it sits on the parchment, as real as Lisbon. Move forward to 1648. A Dutch maritime atlas, produced in Amsterdam during the golden age of Dutch exploration and trade. By this point, Dutch ships have circled the globe multiple times. They've mapped coastlines from Java to Japan, from the Cape of Good Hope to the Caribbean. Their cartographers are considered the finest in the world, combining mathematical precision with artistic beauty. And on their maps, taking up enormous space in the Southern Ocean, is Terra Australis. They call it by different names, sometimes Magellanica, after the explorer who sailed through the straits at the bottom of South America. But the continent itself remains solid and certain. Another century passes. A French atlas from 1756, created during the Age of Enlightenment, when reason and empirical observation are supposedly overtaking medieval superstition. The French cartographers are working with reports from dozens of expeditions, comparing notes with their counterparts in London and Madrid, using the latest instruments to verify coordinates and distances. They've corrected countless errors from earlier maps. They've removed sea monsters and mythical islands. They've redrawn coastlines based on actual observation. But Terra Australis remains. Each of these maps was created by different people, in different countries, working from different sources. Yet they all show essentially the same thing: a vast southern continent occupying the bottom of the world. The details vary slightly. Some show it connected to South America. Others leave a gap, a strait that might allow passage. The interior features shift from map to map. Here, a mountain range. There, a system of rivers. Sometimes whole regions with names that sound like places but correspond to nothing in reality. What's unsettling isn't just that the continent appears. It's how it appears. Not tentatively marked with dotted lines or question marks. Not labelled as theoretical or speculative. It's drawn with the same authoritative certainty as England or Spain. The same solid coastlines. The same confident detail. In some maps, it's actually more detailed than parts of Africa or Asia that Europeans had been visiting for centuries. These weren't ignorant people repeating ancient myths without thought. These were the finest scientific minds of their age. Men who could calculate the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Who could predict eclipses years in advance. Who could navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean and arrive at their destination within a few miles of their intended target. They had access to reports from hundreds of expeditions, testimonies from explorers who claimed to have sailed along its coasts, descriptions of its geography that seemed to confirm what the old theories predicted. If they were wrong about something, this fundamental, a continent that never existed, what does that tell us about the nature of knowledge itself? What does it suggest about the things we believe with absolute certainty today? But one map stands above all others. One map that was so detailed, so convincing, that it convinced a king to fund an expedition that would change everything. In 1642, the Dutch East India Company commissioned Abel Tasman to settle the question once and for all. They gave him 2 ships, provisions for 3 years, and the best maps available. His orders were explicit: sail south, find the great continent, chart its coastlines, assess its resources, and claim it for the Netherlands. The maps showed him exactly where to go. The scholars had calculated the coordinates. The previous expeditions had provided just enough tantalizing evidence to make the company's investors believe that fortune was within reach. Tasman was a careful man, methodical in a way that made him valuable to merchants who couldn't afford romantic failures. He'd spent 20 years at sea, navigated waters from Japan to the Indian Ocean, survived storms that had killed lesser sailors. He knew how to read the sky, how to measure latitude with precision, how to keep a crew alive when supplies ran low. If anyone could find Terra Australis, it would be him. The ships left Batavia in August, sailing south and then east, following the routes indicated by the best cartographic minds in Europe. The crew was prepared for a long journey. They'd heard stories about the southern continent, rumours of gold, of strange animals, of indigenous peoples who might become trading partners or enemies. Some sailors believed they were sailing toward paradise. Others feared they were heading into regions where the sea itself froze and ships became trapped in ice until spring. Days became weeks. The ocean stretched out in every direction, grey and endless under changing skies. They crossed the latitude, where the maps showed the northern coast of Terra Australis should begin. There was no coast, only water. They sailed further south, still nothing. The weather grew colder, the waves taller. The crew began to mutter about the reliability of the maps, about whether the scholars who'd drawn them had ever actually been to sea. Tasman pushed on. Perhaps they'd missed it. Perhaps the continent lay further east, or further west. Perhaps the earlier explorers had made an error in their calculations, and the coastline was actually several degrees south of where the maps indicated. The company had invested enormous sums in this expedition. Kings and queens had staked political claims on the existence of this land. The greatest scholars in Europe had confirmed its presence. It had to be there. They found islands beautiful, lush islands that would later become Tasmania and New Zealand. Tasman charted them carefully, named them, noted their resources and their inhabitants. Under different circumstances, these discoveries would have been considered a triumph. But they weren't what he'd been sent to find. The maps didn't show scattered islands. They showed a continent. Something vast and continuous, something that would reshape global trade and establish Dutch dominance over the southern hemisphere. Months passed. Supplies dwindled. The crew grew restless, then angry, then resigned. Eventually, Tasman turned the ships north and began the long journey back to Batavia. He'd sailed through waters where Terra Australis supposedly existed. He'd crossed and recrossed latitudes where its mountains should have been visible from the deck. He'd found nothing but ocean cold, grey, indifferent ocean that didn't care about maps or theories or the confidence of European scholars. When he returned, his report was precise and damning. The continent, as drawn on the maps, was not where it was supposed to be. If it existed at all, it lay further south than any ship could safely sail, beyond regions where ice made navigation impossible. His career never recovered from that failure. But Tasman's failure should have ended the myth. It didn't. For another 150 years, cartographers kept drawing the continent. The question isn't just why it was drawn in the first place, it's why it refused to disappear, even after explorers proved it wasn't there. The story begins not with exploration, but with mathematics. 2,300 years ago, in the libraries of Alexandria and the academies of Athens, Greek philosophers were trying to understand the shape of the world. They'd already determined the Earth was spherical, contrary to popular belief. Educated people in the ancient world knew this. They could see ships disappear hull first over the horizon. They could observe the Earth's curved shadow during lunar eclipses. They could measure the angle of the sun at different latitudes and calculate the planet's circumference with surprising accuracy. But knowing the Earth was round created a problem of balance. Aristotle observed the obvious. The northern hemisphere contained enormous landmasses, Europe, Asia, Africa, vast continents, representing millions of square miles of solid Earth. The southern hemisphere, as far as anyone could tell from limited exploration, seemed to be mostly water. This troubled the philosophers. Not because they'd sailed south and confirmed it, but because it violated a principle they considered fundamental, the principle of symmetry. In their understanding of physics, which wasn't wrong, just incomplete, a sphere needed to be balanced. If all the weight sat on one side, the Earth would topple. It was the same logic that governed scales and levers, architecture and engineering. Every structure needed equal weight distributed properly, or it would collapse. Why would the Earth be any different? Ptolemy, whose geographical treatises would influence cartography for over 1,000 years, formalized this into theory. There must be, he reasoned, a corresponding landmass in the southern hemisphere. Not because anyone had seen it, but because geometry demanded it. The math required it. Without a southern continent to counterbalance the northern landmasses, the Earth couldn't maintain its rotation. It would wobble, tilt, perhaps eventually tip over entirely. This wasn't superstition. It was rational thought applied to limited information. It was the best minds of the age trying to make sense of the world using the frameworks they had available. And the seductive thing about the theory was how perfectly reasonable it sounded. Doesn't nature favor balance? Doesn't symmetry appear everywhere we look in the human body, in the shapes of animals, in the patterns of leaves and flowers? Why wouldn't the Earth itself follow these same principles? The theory might have died with the ancient world, lost like so many other ideas when the library at Alexandria burned and the Roman Empire collapsed. But it didn't. Medieval Islamic scholars preserved the Greek texts, translating and commenting on them, passing them through centuries when Europe had largely forgotten its own intellectual heritage. When the Renaissance began and Europeans started rediscovering classical learning, Ptolemy's geography was among the treasures they found. And suddenly, the theory had new life. Not because new evidence supported it, no one had sailed south and confirmed the continent's existence, but because it fit so perfectly with how educated people thought the world should work. It made sense. It was elegant. It solved a problem that seemed to need solving. By the time European ships began exploring beyond their traditional waters, the existence of a southern continent wasn't a question. It was an assumption, built into the very foundation of geographical knowledge. The only questions remaining were, where exactly was it, how large was it, and what wealth might it contain? But ancient theories were just the seed. Something happened in the 1500s that transformed this philosophical idea into cartographic fact. Someone claimed they'd seen it. In 1503, a Portuguese captain whose name has been lost to history, or perhaps deliberately obscured, returned to Lisbon with an account that would change cartography forever. He reported sailing along the coast of the southern continent for 6 weeks. His journal described mountains rising from mist-covered shores, rivers emptying into the sea, forests that seemed to stretch inland without end. He recorded latitude measurements, noted weather patterns, even described smoke from what appeared to be indigenous settlements. The account was detailed in ways that vague rumours are not. He specified seeing a distinctive mountain peak at a particular latitude. He described a bay suitable for anchoring, with fresh water available from a stream. He noted the colour of the sand on beaches, the types of birds that flew overhead, the temperature of the water at different points along the coast. These weren't the fantasies of a sailor telling tales in a tavern. They read like proper navigational reports, the kind that would be filed with maritime authorities and consulted by future expeditions. The royal geographers examined his testimony. They questioned him extensively, and they believed him. His account was entered into the official archives, marked as verified information, and used as the basis for updating maps. Other explorers read his report and prepared their own expeditions, confident they knew where to sail. Here's what makes this complicated. Modern analysis of his route, triangulating from his other confirmed sightings and calculating his ship's speed and bearing, proves he was nowhere near where he claimed to see the continent. He was at least 2,000 miles too far north. At the latitude where he reported seeing that distinctive mountain peak, there is only open ocean. There has only ever been open ocean. So, was he lying? That's the obvious conclusion. Perhaps he needed to justify the expedition's expense. Perhaps he hoped to secure funding for a return voyage. Perhaps he wanted glory, or simply to avoid admitting failure. Lying to sponsors and authorities was not uncommon among explorers of the era. But there's another possibility, one that's psychologically more interesting and more unsettling. Perhaps he genuinely believed what he reported. Perhaps, after months at sea, searching for something he absolutely expected to find, his mind filled in what his eyes couldn't see. Perhaps fog and distance transformed ordinary islands into continental coastlines. Perhaps storms and disorientation confused his navigational readings more than he realized. Perhaps expectation shaped perception until he saw what he needed to see. Human memory is not a recording device. It's a reconstruction, influenced by belief, expectation, and context. Sailors in isolation, scanning empty horizons for weeks, under pressure to succeed, already convinced the continent existed. Their minds would have been primed to interpret any ambiguous sight as confirmation. The geographical societies of his time didn't have modern tools to verify his claims. They had his testimony, which seemed credible. They had the ancient theories, which said the continent should be there. And they had a growing collection of similar reports from other explorers, each one adding detail, each one seeming to confirm what the others had said. Whether the explorers lied or were deceived by their own expectations, their accounts had a powerful effect. They transformed an abstract theory into something concrete. But it was the mapmakers who would cement this phantom into reality. Step inside a cartographer's workshop in Amsterdam, circa 1650. The room smells of ink and vellum, of the linseed oil used to preserve the tools, of the coffee that keeps the craftsman working through long afternoons. Light streams through tall windows, carefully positioned to illuminate the work tables without creating shadows that might cause errors. Maps in various stages of completion cover every surface, some just rough sketches establishing coastlines, others nearly finished, waiting only for the final calligraphy and decorative elements that will transform them from technical documents into works of art. The cartographer himself rarely travels. He spent his entire career in this city, perhaps venturing as far as Paris or London, but never boarding a ship bound for distant waters. Yet he's responsible for drawing the world, all of it. Every coastline, every island, every river and mountain range from the Arctic to the Antarctic. How does he do this? Through compilation. He collects reports from ship captains, reads accounts from explorers, studies letters from missionaries and merchants stationed in foreign lands. He has access to earlier maps, dozens of them, some dating back a century or more. He consults with other cartographers, comparing notes, debating disputed features, gradually building consensus about what exists where. But here's the essential problem. The information is incomplete. Large portions of the world have never been visited by anyone whose reports reached Europe. Even areas that have been explored often have conflicting accounts. One captain says there's an island at a certain latitude, another says there's nothing but open water. Weather and navigation errors create confusion. Political motivations lead some explorers to misreport what they've found, claiming discovery of wealthy lands to secure additional funding. And yet, the cartographer cannot leave blank space. This is crucial to understanding how Terra Australis evolved. A map with vast empty regions looks unfinished, unprofessional, ignorant. It suggests the cartographer doesn't know his craft, that he hasn't done proper research, that he lacks access to the latest information. In an era when maps are expensive, commissions from wealthy patrons, nobles who want to display their sophistication, merchants who need reliable navigation aids, kings who use maps to justify territorial claims, appearing ignorant is not acceptable. So, the cartographer fills the gaps. He draws coastlines where coastlines seem likely to be. He extends mountain ranges where the logic of geography suggests they should continue. He places rivers flowing in directions that match the terrain's apparent slope. When he has no information at all, he relies on theory and symmetry and probability. For Terra Australis, the process was particularly tempting. The ancient theory said it should exist. Multiple explorers claimed to have seen it. The logic of planetary balance seemed to require it. And the Southern Ocean was so rarely traversed, so dangerous and remote, that few contradictory reports existed to challenge the consensus. The first generation of maps showed Terra Australis tentatively a vague coastline sketched across the bottom, perhaps with a note indicating uncertainty. But the next generation of cartographers, studying these maps, saw that tentative line and assumed it was based on genuine exploration. After all, why would a reputable cartographer draw it otherwise? They copied the coastline, perhaps adding a bit more detail based on some new report they'd received, or simply because adding detail made the map look more authoritative. The third generation saw even more confidence in the maps they studied. The coastline appeared on multiple sources now. Different cartographers agreed on its basic shape. Surely this meant the information was reliable. They added interior features, mountains, rivers, regional names. They drew it larger, extending it further south, filling in areas that previous maps had left vague. Each generation built on the last, mistaking accumulated speculation for verified knowledge. The mapmakers weren't conspiring to deceive anyone. They were doing their jobs, using the best information available, following professional standards that valued completeness and confidence over cautious uncertainty. They were caught in a feedback loop where each iteration of Terra Australis made the next iteration seem more credible. The economic pressures reinforced this tendency. A cartographer who produced maps that contradicted established authorities risked his reputation. Clients wanted maps that matched what they'd seen before, that confirmed what they'd been taught, that aligned with the reports they'd read from explorers and the theories they'd learned from scholars. Innovation was valued, but only if it meant adding detail, not questioning fundamentals. And there was beauty in it, undeniably. The maps of Terra Australis from this era are gorgeous objects, mountains rendered in careful cross-hatching, coastlines flowing in elegant curves, Latin inscriptions declaring this region or that. Sea monsters cavort in the surrounding waters. Decorative compass roses mark the cardinal directions. The unknown continent is made tangible, transformed from abstraction into something you could almost reach out and touch. This is how consensus reality gets constructed. Not through conspiracy or deliberate deception, but through well-meaning people working within systems that reward confidence over accuracy, completeness over honesty about ignorance. The same dynamics that created Terra Australis operate today in different contexts, in how scientific papers cite each other until questionable findings become accepted facts, in how Wikipedia articles reference each other in circular loops, in how social media algorithms amplify confident claims over careful qualifications. The mapmakers of the Renaissance were doing their best with the tools and incentives they had. They created something that looked real, that felt real, that everyone agreed was real, and for 200 years, that was enough to make it true, at least on paper. By 1700, Terra Australis Incognita had become one of the most detailed regions on world maps. It had mountain ranges, river systems, even political boundaries drawn by European powers, claiming territory they'd never seen. But something was beginning to change. A few explorers were starting to ask dangerous questions. By the middle of the 18th century, a few men had begun to notice something troubling. They were navigators, mostly practical sailors, who spent more time reading the stars than reading philosophical treatises. Men whose lives depended on the accuracy of their charts and the precision of their observations. And their observations weren't matching the maps. One of them, his name appears in records but has been largely forgotten. By history had spent 30 years at sea. He'd sailed routes from the Caribbean to the East Indies, survived storms that sank lesser ships. Navigated by instruments he'd calibrated himself with obsessive care. He was not a man given to fancy or exaggeration. His logbooks were models of methodical detail, recording latitude and longitude, wind speed and water temperature, every measurement verified and cross-checked. He'd sailed south 3 times, each voyage pushing further into the latitudes where Terra Australis supposedly began. He'd seen ice. He'd seen storms. He'd seen ocean that stretched to the horizon in every direction, grey and empty under overcast skies. What he had not seen was a continent. In 1767, he did something that must have required either great courage or great foolishness. He stood before the Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific body in Britain, perhaps in all of Europe, and presented his findings. He brought his logbooks. He brought his charts, showing the routes he'd sailed. He brought calculations demonstrating that he had crossed and recrossed latitudes where the maps indicated continental coastline. And he stated, clearly and without qualification, that Terra Australis did not exist where the cartographers claimed it existed. If it existed at all, it lay further south, beyond where any ship of the era could safely venture. The reaction was not what he might have hoped. The establishment cartographers did not thank him for his careful observations. They did not praise his methodical approach or his 3 decades of experience. Instead, they questioned his competence. Perhaps his instruments were faulty. Chronometers were delicate devices, easily knocked out of calibration. Perhaps his calculations were wrong. Longitude remained notoriously difficult to determine with perfect accuracy. Perhaps the weather had been poor, visibility limited, and he'd simply missed the coastline he sailed past. Other explorers, men who'd staked their reputations on finding Terra Australis, dismissed him more directly. They suggested he'd been afraid to sail far enough south, that he'd turned back too soon, that his crew had pressured him to retreat before reaching the continent. After all, they pointed out, other captains had reported seeing it. Were all those accounts simply lies or mistakes? Then there were the economic interests. Trading companies had sold shares in future expeditions to Terra Australis. They'd promised investors access to the continent's resources once it was properly claimed and colonized. Royal patents had been granted for exclusive trading rights in regions of the southern continent. All of this was built on the assumption that the land existed. A navigator claiming otherwise wasn't just challenging geographical knowledge, he was threatening financial interests. The scientific establishment, the commercial interests, the other explorers invested in the myth, all of them had reasons to reject his findings. And they did. His presentation was noted in the Royal Society's records and then essentially ignored. His charts were filed away rather than incorporated into new maps. Invitations to present his research elsewhere never materialized. He died 15 years later, his insights largely dismissed, his name absent from the major geographical debates of his time. But his maps survived, his logbooks survived, and in them, recorded with mechanical precision, was evidence that reality differed from consensus. Truth doesn't win simply because it's true. It needs advocates. It needs institutional support. It needs to overcome the inertia of established belief and the resistance of vested interests. Sometimes, it needs people to die literally, for generations to pass before old certainties can be questioned. The navigator died largely forgotten, but his maps survived. And slowly, imperceptibly, other explorers began to notice the same troubling pattern. The further south they sailed, the less their observations matched the maps. Reality was beginning to contradict consensus. The 1,770 seconds brought a strange phenomenon to the world of cartography. If you laid out maps of the southern hemisphere chronologically, year by year, and watched them in sequence, you'd see something remarkable. Terra Australis was vanishing. Not all at once. That would have required someone to admit error, which institutions are remarkably reluctant to do, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a photograph fading in sunlight. A French expedition in 1772 sailed through waters where earlier maps showed definite coastline. They found only ocean. A Spanish voyage in 1775 crossed latitudes that should have been well inland on the great southern continent. Their logs recorded nothing but waves and wind. British ships, Dutch merchants, Portuguese explorers all began returning with the same troubling news. The continent wasn't where the maps said it was. But the maps didn't simply remove it. That would have been too stark an admission. Instead, they began to shrink it. Look at a map from 1750. Terra Australis stretches across the bottom of the world, solid and confident, occupying perhaps a fifth of the southern hemisphere. Its coastline is clearly drawn. Interior features, mountain ranges, river systems are marked with apparent certainty. It looks as real as any other landmass on the map. Now look at a map from 1770. The continent is still there, but something has changed. The coastline is less definite, more tentative. The solid line has become broken in places, suggesting gaps, straits, and possible passages. Some of the interior details have disappeared. The whole thing has shifted slightly further south, as if retreating from the mounting evidence against it. By 1790, Terra Australis has become a ghost of its former self. It's fragmented now, broken into a series of large islands or peninsulas rather than one continuous landmass. The blank spaces have grown. The confident names of regions have been replaced by question marks or simply left unlabeled. It's being erased, but slowly, carefully, in a way that allows everyone involved to preserve their dignity. This is how institutions handle being wrong, not through dramatic admission of error, but through gradual adjustment. No single cartographer had to stand up and declare that all previous maps were false. No geographical society had to issue a formal retraction. Instead, each new generation of maps showed slightly less confidence than the previous one. Each edition incorporated the latest reports, while quietly abandoning the claims that those reports contradicted. It's a fascinating psychological process. The cartographers weren't conspiring to deceive anyone. They were genuinely trying to reconcile conflicting information. The ancient theories that said the continent should exist, the explorer accounts that claimed to have seen it, and the mounting evidence from newer expeditions that it wasn't where anyone thought it was. Their solution was compromise. Perhaps the earlier explorers had been right but imprecise about the location. Perhaps the continent existed but was smaller than originally believed. Perhaps it was heavily fragmented, difficult to distinguish from large islands. Each compromise allowed the profession to continue respecting its predecessors while incorporating new information. No one had to be called a liar or a fool. The old cartographers weren't wrong. Exactly, they were just working with incomplete information. The new cartographers weren't contradicting their elders. They were refining and improving upon their work. This same pattern appears throughout the history of knowledge. Scientific theories don't usually collapse in a single dramatic moment. They fade gradually, losing support around the edges, becoming qualified and hedged, until eventually a new generation simply stops defending them. Ptolemaic astronomy wasn't disproven overnight by Copernicus. It lingered for a century, with astronomers adding increasingly complex modifications to make it fit observations, until finally it became easier to adopt the new model than to maintain the old one. Terra Australis followed the same trajectory. By 1795, most educated Europeans understood that the vast temperate continent of legend didn't exist. But it took decades for that understanding to become unanimous, for the last defenders to retire or die, for the maps to finally show the southern hemisphere as it actually was, rather than as theory predicted it should be. But the final blow wouldn't come from gradual accumulation of evidence. It would come from a single voyage that left no room for doubt. A voyage led by a man who would map the southern hemisphere with unprecedented accuracy, and in doing so, erase a continent from human imagination. James Cook's second voyage left Plymouth in July 1772 with a singular purpose. The Admiralty had given him the most advanced navigational instruments available: Harrison's chronometer for calculating longitude with unprecedented precision, improved sextants for determining latitude, telescopes for astronomical observations. His orders were explicit: sail as far south as physically possible and determine, once and for all, whether Terra Australis existed. Cook was methodical in ways that made him perfect for this mission. He didn't chase glory or cultivate mystery. He measured, recorded, verified. His journals read like technical reports rather than adventure narratives, coordinates, temperatures, wind directions, all noted with mechanical precision. He was 43 years old, already famous from his first circumnavigation, respected by the scientific establishment, trusted by the Admiralty. The voyage took 3 years. Cook pushed his ships through waters that terrified experienced sailors. He crossed the Antarctic Circle, the first European commander to do so, and kept going. Pack ice closed in around the ships, grinding against the hulls, threatening to crush them. Temperatures dropped until the rigging froze, and sailors suffered frostbite despite their heavy clothing. The sea turned grey-black, thick with floating ice, utterly hostile to human life. And everywhere Cook sailed, he recorded coordinates. At every latitude where the maps showed Terra Australis should begin, he noted only ice and ocean. He sailed east, then west, tracing the southern latitudes in long arcs, searching for any sign of the continent that was supposed to dominate the bottom of the world. His journals are almost clinical in their repetition. Ice, ocean, no land visible, day after day, week after week. At one point, he reached 71 degrees south, further than any ship had ever ventured. The maps insisted that at such latitudes, he should have been hundreds of miles inland on the great continent. Instead, he found only an impenetrable wall of ice, stretching to the horizon in every direction. When he returned to England in 1775, Cook wrote his conclusion with devastating simplicity. If Terra Australis existed, it lay entirely beyond the ice, in regions no ship could reach, covered in glaciers that made it worthless for habitation or commerce. The continent of legend, the temperate land of wealth and resources that had appeared on maps for 3 centuries, did not exist. The impact was immediate and total. Unlike the earlier navigator who'd been dismissed, Cook had the authority that came from reputation and institutional backing. He'd already mapped New Zealand and the east coast of Australia. He'd proven himself to be careful, accurate, uninterested in exaggeration or fantasy. The Royal Society believed him. The Admiralty believed him. Within a decade, Terra Australis had vanished from serious maps. But here's what's fascinating. Cook wasn't saying anything fundamentally different from what the dismissed navigator had said 8 years earlier. The evidence was similar. The conclusion was the same. What changed was who delivered the message. The earlier navigator was ignored because he lacked sufficient authority. Cook was believed because he had earned the right to be heard. This tells us something important about how knowledge changes. Truth doesn't always triumph simply because it corresponds to reality. It needs the right messenger. It needs institutional support. It needs to be delivered at the right moment, in the right context, by someone with enough credibility that challenging them becomes more difficult than accepting what they say. By 1800, Terra Australis Incognita had been replaced on maps by the accurate coastlines of Australia, New Zealand, and the frozen wasteland that would eventually be named Antarctica. The phantom continent was gone, erased by precision instruments and methodical observation. Cook's voyage should have ended the story. Terra Australis disappeared from maps almost immediately. By 1800, it was gone, replaced by accurate coastlines of Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica. But the more interesting question remains: why did it exist in the first place? What does this phantom continent tell us about how humans understand reality? There's a moment in the journal of a Portuguese navigator, dated 1618, that reveals something essential about human perception. He's been at sea for 43 days, sailing south through waters where Terra Australis should begin to appear. The weather has been grey and overcast for a week, and then, at dawn on the 44th day, he sees it. Mountains rising from the mist. A dark coastline stretching east and west as far as the eye can follow. He notes the coordinates carefully, describes the peaks, estimates the distance. His crew confirms the sighting. They've found it. Except they hadn't. Modern analysis of his route, cross-referenced with his other confirmed positions, proves conclusively that he was looking at clouds. Low-hanging clouds backlit by the rising sun, creating the illusion of solid land where nothing existed but air and water vapor. Within hours, the coastline had dissipated completely, but by then, the sighting was already recorded in his log as fact. He wasn't lying. He wasn't even careless. He was experiencing something that neuroscience now understands quite well: expectation-driven perception. When your brain is primed to see something, when you've been searching for it day after day, when everything you've been taught says it should be there, your visual processing system becomes remarkably creative about finding it. The human brain is not a camera. It's not passively recording what enters through the eyes. Instead, it's constantly predicting what should be there, using context and expectation to fill in ambiguous information. This works beautifully most of the time. It's why you can recognize faces instantly, why you can read handwriting even when half the letters are unclear, why you can navigate familiar rooms in near darkness. Your brain uses what it expects to see to interpret what little information actually arrives. But when expectations are wrong, the system produces ghosts. You see patterns that aren't there, movement where nothing moves, faces in random shapes, continents in fog and cloud, and the play of light on distant waves. The explorers searching for Terra Australis were operating under extreme conditions that amplified these effects. Months of isolation at sea, scanning endless horizons for any sign of land. Sleep deprivation from standing watch. Stress from knowing their careers and possibly their lives depended on success. The constant motion of the ship, the disorientation of being surrounded by water in every direction, the difficulty of judging distance when there are no reference points. Under such conditions, the brain's tendency to find patterns and fulfill expectations goes into overdrive. Modern studies of eyewitness testimony reveal the same mechanisms. People who expect to see a weapon in a suspect's hand are more likely to report seeing one, even when later evidence proves their hands were empty. Communities expecting to see UFOs report vastly more sightings than communities without that expectation, even though both are looking at the same sky. The same lights, clouds, and atmospheric phenomena get interpreted completely differently, depending on what the observer believes they're likely to see. This isn't stupidity, it's not gullibility. It's the normal functioning of human perception, operating exactly as it evolved to operate. The brain prioritizes speed over perfect accuracy, makes educated guesses rather than waiting for complete information, sees what's likely to be there rather than painstakingly analyzing every photon that enters the retina. Usually this works. Usually what's likely to be there actually is there. But when you're searching for something that doesn't exist, when your expectations are based on theory rather than reality, when everyone around you confirms that yes, it should be there, the system breaks down. You see coastlines in clouds, mountains in mist, continents in nothing at all. The same mechanism that made you see faces in clouds as a child made Renaissance explorers see Terra Australis in the grey expanse of the Southern Ocean. The only difference is that no one told them they were wrong, not for 200 years. But individual psychology only explains so much. Terra Australis persisted because individuals weren't operating alone. They were embedded in social networks, institutions, and economic systems that amplified certain beliefs while suppressing doubt. To understand the phantom continent, we need to understand the social construction of reality. Imagine you're a cartographer in Amsterdam, working in the year 1650. You've apprenticed under a master for 7 years, learned the craft of map-making, studied the great works of your predecessors. Now you're ready to create your first major atlas. You sit down to draw the southern hemisphere, and you face a choice. Your own knowledge of the region is limited. You've never sailed south of the Cape of Good Hope, but you're not working in isolation. You have access to dozens of earlier maps, created by respected cartographers across Europe. You've read accounts from explorers, studied the theories of ancient geographers, consulted with the scholars who advised the Dutch East India Company, and all of them, every single source you can find confirms that Terra Australis exists. Now imagine a single explorer comes to your workshop. He claims to have sailed where the continent should be and found nothing. Do you believe him? Do you discard centuries of accumulated knowledge, contradict every authority in your profession, based on one man's word? Or do you assume he made an error, miscalculated his position, missed the coastline in bad weather, simply didn't sail far enough south? The rational choice, in that moment, is to trust the consensus. One dissenting voice against a chorus of agreement. One person's experience against centuries of theory and multiple confirming reports. You draw the continent, not because you're stupid or dishonest, but because doing otherwise would require an extraordinary level of skepticism toward your entire profession. This is how information cascades work. Each person observes what others before them believed and uses that social proof as evidence. The first few cartographers might have drawn Terra Australis based on theory and sparse reports. But later cartographers saw that earlier experts had included it, which seemed like evidence that it must be real. Their inclusion of the continent became evidence for the next generation, and so on, each iteration adding weight to what began as speculation. At every level of society, the same dynamic operated. Ship captains seeking funding for expeditions pointed to the maps as proof the continent existed, which convinced investors to provide money, which funded expeditions that sometimes reported ambiguous findings, which convinced cartographers to keep drawing it, which convinced the next generation of captains and investors. A closed loop, each element reinforcing the others. The institutions became invested too, though not through any conspiracy. The Royal Society had published papers about Terra Australis. Universities taught its existence in geography courses. Trading companies had sold shares in ventures to exploit its resources. Governments had issued patents, granting exclusive rights to trade with regions of the southern continent. Admitting the continent didn't exist would mean admitting that scholarly institutions had been wrong, that investors had been defrauded, that government patents were worthless, that generations of educated people had believed something false. The social cost of being right became higher than the cost of being wrong. An individual cartographer who rejected Terra Australis risked professional ruin, accused of incompetence, denied commissions, dismissed by the scholarly community. An individual who accepted its existence, meanwhile, faced no immediate consequences. If the continent turned out not to exist, well, everyone else was wrong too. Safety in numbers. This pattern appears throughout human history. Financial bubbles operate on identical logic. Everyone sees others buying, assumes they know something, and buys as well, creating cascades where prices rise far beyond any rational valuation. Political movements entrench themselves through similar mechanisms, where expressing doubt means social exile, while expressing certainty means belonging. Even scientific paradigms resist change, because researchers who challenge established theory face rejection, while those who work within it receive funding, publication, and professional advancement. Terra Australis persisted for 2 centuries, not despite human rationality but because of it. Given the information available, given the social context, given the incentive structures, believing in the continent was the reasonable choice for most people most of the time. Being right would have meant being alone. Social psychology explains how Terra Australis spread and persisted. But there's another dimension to this mystery. Why did people want it to exist? What emotional need did this phantom continent fulfill? There's something in human nature that needs the unknown to exist. Not just tolerate it, but need it. The explorers who searched for Terra Australis weren't just following maps or chasing commercial opportunity. They were pursuing something deeper, something that sits at the core of what makes us human, the possibility that somewhere, beyond the horizon, things might be different from what we know. Terra Australis became a mirror. Merchants saw wealth, gold, spices, trade routes that would make them rich beyond measure. The continent on the maps was always rich, always full of resources, because that's what merchants needed it to be. Missionaries saw souls to save, vast populations who'd never heard Christian teaching, the opportunity for spiritual conquest that would justify their calling. Naturalists imagined undiscovered species, new forms of life that would revolutionize understanding of God's creation. Naval powers saw strategic harbors, military advantage, the possibility of empire. The phantom continent held whatever you needed it to hold. It was the perfect frontier because it wasn't real enough to disappoint. You could project anything onto it, and reality couldn't contradict you. Not yet. Not until you actually sailed there. This psychological function of unknown spaces runs deep in human culture. The wilderness beyond the village, the forest where the map says, "Here be dragons," the far side of the mountain, the depths of the ocean, the reaches of space. These aren't just geographical locations, they're psychological territories where normal rules might not apply, where transformation is possible, where you might discover not just new lands but a new version of yourself. Frontier spaces promise escape from constraint. If you're poor in England, perhaps you'll be wealthy in Terra Australis. If you're a nobody in Amsterdam, perhaps you'll be famous as the first to map its interior. If your life feels small and predetermined, perhaps out there, in the unknown, you could become something else. The blank spaces on maps aren't empty, they're full of possibility. When Cook erased Terra Australis from the maps, he did more than correct a geographical error. He closed a space that had been open in human imagination for 2,000 years. By 1800, the world was becoming fully known. The blanks on maps were filling in. Every coastline charted, every interior explored, every island catalogued. The Earth was shrinking, becoming calculable, losing its capacity to surprise. There's a melancholy in this. Yes, accurate maps enable better navigation, safer voyages, more efficient trade. Knowledge is useful. But something is also lost. The 17th century maps with their phantom continent, their sea monsters, their ornate decorations marking the edges of the known world they captured, something true about human experience that modern maps, for all their accuracy, cannot. They showed that the world still held mystery. That possibility still existed, that you could still sail towards something wholly unknown. We're told this is progress, the elimination of error, the triumph of empirical observation over speculation, and it is. But it's also the closing of a particular kind of space that humans seem to need. A space where what we hope might be true isn't yet contradicted by what actually is. The story doesn't end with Terra Australis disappearing from maps, because in the space where the phantom continent once lived, explorers found something real, something that would prove to be far stranger and more important than the myth it replaced. The irony is almost perfect, almost cruel in its way. The ancient Greeks were right. There is a massive continent in the south. It sits at the bottom of the world, enormous and undeniable, larger than Europe, larger than Australia. The philosophers who reasoned from geometry and symmetry, who predicted a southern landmass to balance the northern continents, they weren't wrong. Not entirely. They were just wrong about everything else. The continent that actually exists bears no resemblance to the one that appeared on maps for 3 centuries. Where Terra Australis promised temperate climates and fertile soil, Antarctica offers nothing but ice. Where the phantom continent suggested wealth and resources, the real one is almost worthless commercially, at least by the standards that drove exploration. Where maps showed forests and rivers and regions suitable for settlement, reality presents a frozen desert more hostile to human life than anywhere else on Earth. The discovery happened in pieces, slowly, painfully. Russian expeditions in 1820 glimpsed ice cliffs and reported seeing land beyond. British and American ships confirmed these sightings over the next few decades, but confirmation that it was actually a continent, not just a collection of large islands surrounded by ice, took until the early 1900s. The explorers who mapped it did so under conditions that make the search for Terra Australis look comfortable by comparison. They faced temperatures that could kill exposed skin in minutes, winds that could knock a grown man off his feet, ice that shifted and cracked without warning, threatening to swallow entire expeditions. Ships became trapped for months, their crews surviving on dwindling supplies while waiting for spring thaws. Some explorers never returned. Others came back with accounts of landscapes so alien, so utterly incompatible with human life, that they struggled to describe what they'd seen. The continent they mapped was covered in ice, 2 miles thick in places. Mountains rose through the glaciers, but they were imprisoned in white, lifeless. The interior was a plateau of snow and ice, stretching for thousands of miles, devoid of any living thing except occasionally a lost bird blown off course. The temperature in winter dropped to levels that defy easy comprehension. -100 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes lower. At such temperatures, exposed metal becomes brittle enough to shatter. Breath freezes before it can disperse. The human body begins to shut down within minutes. This was the continent that replaced the Phantom. This was what had been hiding in the south all along, waiting to be found once explorers pushed far enough through the ice to reach it. The psychological adjustment must have been strange for cartographers and geographers. They'd been simultaneously vindicated and utterly wrong. Yes, there was a southern continent, just as theory predicted. But no, it wasn't anything like what anyone had imagined. The maps that showed Terra Australis, covered in vegetation, divided into regions, promising wealth, they were fantasies. The reality was so different that it barely counted as the same category of thing. Antarctica is mysterious still, but in a different way than Terra Australis was mysterious. The Phantom Continent was mysterious because no one knew what it might be. It could have been anything, which made it everything. Antarctica is mysterious because we know what it is, and it remains utterly alien. Even now, with modern equipment and scientific stations, the continent resists human presence. We visit it, we study it, but we cannot live there in any meaningful sense. It tolerates our presence the way a wilderness tolerates a passing traveller, temporarily, contingently, always ready to reclaim what we've briefly occupied. Reality had the last laugh. The ancient philosophers were right that there was land in the south. But reality made sure that land was nothing like what anyone expected, nothing like what hope and theory and 2,000 years of speculation had imagined. But Antarctica's discovery didn't just replace one continent with another. It revealed something profound about the southern hemisphere, something that explains why explorers kept failing to find Terra Australis, and why the real south is so different from what anyone imagined. If you could drain the oceans and look at Earth's bare surface, you'd see something striking. The northern hemisphere is crowded with continents. Europe, Asia, and North America cluster relatively close together around the Arctic, their land masses creating a nearly continuous ring of solid ground. Africa extends south, but even it stays mostly north of the equator. The northern half of the planet is land-heavy, with ocean filling the spaces between continents. The south tells a completely different story. The southern hemisphere is 81% water. Not just mostly water, overwhelmingly water. Australia sits isolated, relatively small. South America's southern tip barely extends past 50 degrees south. Africa ends well before the southern extremes. And then there's Antarctica, locked at the pole, surrounded by an unbroken ring of ocean that circles the entire planet. This isn't a minor geographical quirk. It creates an entirely different world. Around Antarctica flows the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the most powerful ocean current on Earth. With no continents to block it, water circles the frozen continent endlessly, driven by the planet's rotation and the fierce winds that howl around the southern latitudes. This current moves more water than all the world's rivers combined. It's deeper, faster, colder than anything in the northern hemisphere. The current creates what oceanographers call a thermal barrier. Cold water from the Antarctic mixes poorly with warmer water from further north. The boundary between them is sharp, almost like a wall in the ocean. This barrier keeps Antarctica frozen even during summer months, when it receives 24 hours of continuous sunlight. The continent is thermally isolated, locked in permanent ice by the very ocean that surrounds it. The weather patterns follow. The Southern Ocean generates the largest waves on Earth, storm systems that circle the globe with nothing to slow them down. Sailors call these latitudes the Roaring Forties, the Furious 50s, the Screaming 60s, each name marking 10 degrees of latitude, where winds reach speeds that would be considered extreme anywhere else, but are merely normal there. Waves build across thousands of miles of fetch, uninterrupted oceans stretching to the horizon in every direction until they reach heights that can swallow ships. This is the environment that Terra Australis was supposedly hiding in. A temperate, fertile continent supposedly existed in waters where the ocean itself makes agriculture impossible, where no trees could grow if land existed, where temperatures stay below freezing year-round. The cartographers who drew Terra Australis were making a fundamental error of perspective. They lived in the northern hemisphere, surrounded by continents, accustomed to seas broken by land, familiar with oceans that could be crossed in weeks. They assumed the south would mirror the north. Why wouldn't it? The Earth is round, symmetric. What's true at one pole should be true at the other. But the distribution of land on Earth isn't symmetric. It's radically unbalanced, with most solid ground concentrated in one hemisphere and most water concentrated in the other. This creates different climate systems, different ocean dynamics, different possibilities for what can exist where. There simply isn't room in the southern hemisphere for a massive temperate continent at the latitudes where Terra Australis was placed. The ocean is too dominant, the circulation patterns too powerful, the thermal isolation too complete. A continent could exist. Antarctica proves that, but not the kind of continent the ancient theories imagined, not something fertile and welcoming, only something frozen and hostile, protected by the most dangerous ocean on Earth. The Renaissance cartographers weren't stupid. They were mapping from incomplete data using logical assumptions based on their experience. But their experience was fundamentally northern. They were trying to understand a hemisphere that operates by completely different rules, using only what they knew from their own half of the planet. They were trying to map an ocean world using the logic of a land world. Understanding the southern hemisphere's geography explains why Terra Australis was impossible. But it also explains something else. How real geographical discoveries in the South, Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands became tangled with the myth, creating confusion that lasted centuries. In 1606, Dutch captain Willem Janszoon sailed his ship the Duifken along the western coast of what we now call Australia. He'd been exploring the waters north of Java, searching for trading opportunities, and his vessel drifted further south than intended. When land appeared on the horizon, his crew must have felt a mix of excitement and vindication. They'd found it, the great southern continent, Terra Australis. They were completely right and completely wrong. Right, because they had discovered a genuine continent in the south, a massive landmass that would turn out to be roughly the size of the continental United States. Wrong, because it wasn't the continent they thought it was. It wasn't the Terra Australis of legend and theory, the temperate paradise that maps had been promising for a century. The coast Janszoon saw was harsh, arid, hostile. No obvious wealth, no easy harbours, just scrubland and heat and a coastline that offered little reason to celebrate. The confusion this created would last for over a century and a half. As more Dutch ships encountered Australia's western and northern coasts, cartographers faced a problem. They'd found land where Terra Australis should be, but it didn't match the descriptions. It was too small, too far north, too obviously inhospitable. Was this the legendary continent, disappointing everyone's expectations? Or was this something else, a large island, perhaps with the real Terra Australis still waiting to be found further south? Many cartographers chose a middle solution that reveals something profound about how human minds handle contradictory information. They drew both. On the same map, you can find Australia labelled as New Holland, clearly depicted as its own distinct landmass. And then, just south of it, separated by ocean, sits Terra Australis, still vast, still promising, still theoretical, but now pushed back just far enough to avoid direct contradiction with what had actually been observed. Reality and myth coexisting, side by side, two continents where one should be impossible. New Zealand created similar confusion. When Abel Tasman encountered it in 1642, he saw only the western coast rugged, mountainous, clearly land, but with no sense of its full extent. Some cartographers drew it as part of Terra Australis, a peninsula extending north from the great continent. Others showed it as a separate discovery. It took Cook's circumnavigation in 1769 to prove definitively that New Zealand was comprised of islands, isolated from any larger landmass. This is how paradigm shifts actually work, not through clean breaks where old knowledge is discarded and new understanding adopted instantly, but through messy transition periods where people try to hold on to both old beliefs and new evidence simultaneously. The human mind is remarkably creative at finding ways to preserve what it wants to believe while acknowledging what it cannot deny. The cartographers weren't being dishonest. They were trying to reconcile multiple truths. The ancient theory said a great southern continent should exist. New discoveries proved there was significant land in the southern hemisphere, but the land they'd found didn't match the land they expected. So perhaps there was both the discovered land and the still undiscovered land, reality and ideal, fact and theory. It took Cook's methodical destruction of every possible location for Terra Australis to finally force the issue. By 1800, there was no space left on maps where the phantom continent could hide. Australia was mapped completely, revealed as an island continent. New Zealand was shown accurately as separate islands. Antarctica was suspected, but known to be nothing like the temperate land of legend. The myth and reality could no longer coexist. One had to surrender. The myth lost. But it took generations longer than it should have, sustained by the human tendency to accommodate contradictions rather than resolve them, to preserve comfortable beliefs even in the face of uncomfortable evidence. By 1800, Terra Australis was gone from maps, replaced by accurate coastlines of real continents and islands. The mystery seemed solved. But the phantom continent's legacy didn't end, it transformed. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it would return in new forms, still shaping how humans imagine the unexplored regions of Earth. Terra Australis disappeared from maps around 1800. By 1850, another lost continent had taken its place in the popular imagination. This one had supposedly sunk beneath the waves thousands of years ago, taking with it an advanced civilization that had mastered technologies we were only beginning to rediscover. Its name was Atlantis, and unlike Terra Australis, it would prove impossible to disprove. The timing is striking, as the last blank spaces were being filled in on world maps, as explorers confirmed that no mysterious continents remained to be discovered. The human fascination with lost lands didn't disappear, it relocated. If there were no undiscovered continents in the present, perhaps there were vanished continents in the past. Plato had mentioned Atlantis in two of his dialogues, written around 360 BCE. For 2,000 years, scholars had generally understood this as allegory, a fictional device Plato used to make philosophical arguments about ideal societies and their corruption. But in 1882, a former congressman from Minnesota named Ignatius Donnelly published a book titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Its central claim was simple and audacious. Plato was reporting history, not inventing fiction. Donnelly's book became a sensation. It sold thousands of copies, was translated into multiple languages, inspired imitators and devotees. Within a decade, Atlantis had become culturally ubiquitous in a way Terra Australis never managed. Books, lectures, societies dedicated to studying the lost continent. People claimed to have channeled its ancient wisdom, recovered its lost knowledge, identified its location everywhere, from the Mediterranean to Antarctica to the mid-Atlantic ridge. Why did Atlantis succeed where Terra Australis had failed? Part of the answer lies in falsifiability. Terra Australis could be disproven. You simply sailed to where it was supposed to be and looked. When Cook did exactly that and found nothing, the myth collapsed. But Atlantis was conveniently located wherever was most difficult to search. When technology improved and ocean floors were mapped, ruling out one proposed location, advocates simply moved it somewhere else. The Black Sea, the Caribbean, off the coast of Spain, under Antarctica's ice. Each time science eliminated one possibility, belief relocated to another. The late 1800s saw an explosion of lost continent theories. Lemuria, supposedly connecting Madagascar and India, populated by a now extinct race. Mu, a vast Pacific landmass that allegedly sank in a cataclysm. Hyperborea, a northern paradise that existed before the ice ages. Each served the same psychological function that Terra Australis once had. They were repositories for human needs that the fully mapped present world could no longer satisfy. But there was a crucial difference. Terra Australis emerged from honest error, ancient theories about planetary balance, misinterpreted explorer reports, the normal functioning of knowledge systems working with incomplete information. The cartographers who drew it genuinely believed in its existence, based on the best evidence and reasoning available to them. The late Victorian lost continent theories emerged from different soil. They appeared after the world was fully mapped, after scientific methodology had been established, after the mechanisms of geology and oceanography were reasonably well understood. They persisted not because evidence supported them, but because evidence couldn't definitively rule them out. They were designed, consciously or not, to be unfalsifiable. This transformation reveals something about how human need for mystery adapts. When geographical exploration closed the frontier of the present, that need migrated to the past. When you can no longer sail toward an unknown continent, you can imagine one that vanished before recorded history. When reality offers no blank spaces left to fill with possibility, you create blank spaces in time instead of space. There's a melancholy to this shift. Terra Australis, for all its errors, represented forward-looking hope. It was about discovery, about what might be found. The lost continent myths of the late 1800s represented backward-looking nostalgia. They suggested that humanity's greatest achievements lay in the past, that wisdom had been lost rather than gained, that we were diminished rather than advancing. The cultural context matters too. This was the height of European imperialism, when Western powers were conquering and cataloguing the last unexplored regions. The romance of lost continents emerged precisely when there were no more real continents left to romanticize. It was a way of preserving mystery in an age that seemed determined to eliminate it. But lost continent myths in the 19th century were just nostalgia and speculation. In the 20th century, something more interesting happened. Science discovered that continents actually do disappear. Not through catastrophe or flood, but through plate tectonics over millions of years. Real lost continents exist, just not where or when the myths claimed. In 2017, a team of geologists published a paper arguing for something that would have seemed absurd to earlier generations. Earth has an eighth continent, not a newly formed landmass, but one that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight beneath the Pacific Ocean. They called it Zealandia, and its existence raises questions about what we mean when we say we've mapped the world. Zealandia is enormous, roughly 2 million square miles, about half the size of Australia. It stretches from New Caledonia in the north to New Zealand's sub-Antarctic islands in the south, a distance of nearly 3,000 miles. If you could drain the ocean, you'd see mountain ranges, river valleys, a landscape that would look perfectly normal from the air. But you can't see it from above the water, because 94% of Zealandia is submerged, lying between a few hundred and several thousand feet below the surface. Only the highest peaks break through New Zealand's North and South Islands, New Caledonia, a scattering of smaller islands that mark the tips of drowned mountains. Early European explorers saw these islands, mapped them, sailed between them without realizing they were looking at fragments of something much larger. They were like people seeing the tops of towers poking above floodwaters, not recognizing that beneath the surface lay an entire drowned city. The story of how Zealandia sank is written in rock and time. About 85 million years ago, during the age of dinosaurs, Zealandia was part of a larger supercontinent that included Australia and Antarctica. Then, continental drift pulled it away, creating a new fragment separated by widening ocean. For millions of years, Zealandia remained above water. We know this from fossils, from the types of rock that form only on dry land, from the erosion patterns that require weather and wind. But then it began to sink. Not catastrophically, not in earthquakes or floods, but gradually, almost imperceptibly by human timescales. The continental crust stretched and thinned. As it thinned, it became less buoyant, settling lower. Over tens of millions of years, the land subsided, inch by inch, until the ocean claimed everything except the highest elevations. This isn't the Atlantis of myth. There was no advanced civilization watching their homeland disappear. No dramatic final day when the seas rushed in. Just geological processes operating at speeds that make human history look like an eye blink. By the time humans evolved, Zealandia had already been underwater for millions of years. What makes this discovery remarkable isn't just that a continent-sized landmass went unrecognized until 2017, it's that the criteria for what makes something a continent are themselves matters of definition and debate. Zealandia meets the geological standards. It has continental crust rather than oceanic crust, distinct from the surrounding ocean floor. It's geologically unified, with boundaries that mark it as a coherent structure. It's elevated above the surrounding abyssal plains, even if that elevation isn't enough to break the surface. But for decades, geologists dismissed Zealandia as just a collection of continental fragments, scattered pieces, not worthy of continental status. The 2017 paper argued otherwise, marshalling evidence from seafloor mapping, satellite measurements, and analysis of rock samples. The scientific community is still debating the claim, which is how science should work: evidence presented, arguments made, consensus forming or failing to form based on the quality of reasoning. The irony isn't lost on careful observers. While Renaissance cartographers drew a fictional continent called Terra Australis across the South Pacific, a real continent lay beneath those same waters, invisible to everyone sailing above it. The phantom and the reality occupied nearly the same space one imagined, where nothing existed, the other existing where no one imagined. This coincidence suggests something about the relationship between human imagination and physical reality. We're remarkably good at inventing things that turn out to exist in forms we didn't predict. Not in the supernatural sense, not prophecy or mystical knowledge, but in the sense that the human mind, groping toward truth with limited information, sometimes guesses correctly while getting all the details wrong. There was a southern continent, just not the one anyone expected, not where the maps showed it, not above water, not remotely useful for the purposes that drove exploration, but real nonetheless, waiting to be recognized for what it actually was, rather than what theory predicted it should be. Zealandia's discovery suggests we should be humble about what we think we know about Earth's geography. But the lesson of Terra Australis goes deeper than just cartography. It's fundamentally about epistemology, about how humans create, maintain, and revise their understanding of reality. And that lesson is urgently relevant today. We look at old maps showing Terra Australis and feel a comfortable superiority. How could they believe that? How could the greatest scientific minds of their age be so completely wrong about something so fundamental? We have better instruments now, better methods, better systems for creating and verifying knowledge. We wouldn't make such errors today, except we do. Constantly, in every field where human understanding meets complex reality. Consider nutrition science over the past 50 years. Fat was deadly, avoided at all costs. Then fat was fine, but carbohydrates were the real enemy. Then some fats were good and others bad. Then maybe carbohydrates weren't so terrible after all, depending on their type and source. Each generation of nutritional advice was delivered with complete confidence by credentialed experts citing peer-reviewed research. Each version contradicted the previous one. Someone must have been wrong, probably many someones, yet the institutional authority delivering these contradictory claims remained intact. Or consider the replication crisis in psychology. Over the past decade, researchers have tried to replicate many famous psychological studies and failed. Results that were taught as established facts, cited in thousands of subsequent papers, incorporated into textbooks. Many of them appear to have been statistical artifacts, flukes, or the product of questionable research practices. Yet these findings shaped policy, influenced therapy practices, were treated as solid knowledge for decades. Economics offers similar patterns. Models that claim to predict market behavior failed spectacularly to anticipate major crises. Theories that seemed to explain how economies work turned out to work only under specific conditions that weren't clearly specified. Yet the experts kept their positions. The models kept being used. The same institutional structures that produced failed predictions remained largely unchanged. Medicine has its own history of confident errors. Treatments that were standard practice for decades, recommended by the most prestigious authorities, later proved harmful or useless. The mechanisms that allowed these practices to become entrenched are the same ones that kept Terra Australis on maps for centuries. Initial claims based on limited evidence, institutional adoption, resistance to contrary findings, economic interests aligned with the status quo, social proof, overwhelming skepticism. This isn't an argument against science or expertise. It's an observation about how knowledge systems work. They're human systems, operating through human institutions, subject to the same cognitive biases and social dynamics that affected Renaissance cartographers. The tools are better now, the methods more rigorous, but the underlying mechanisms remain similar. Initial claims become accepted. Acceptance creates precedent. Precedent influences future research. Research that confirms expectations gets published and cited more readily than research that challenges them. Economic incentives reward staying within established paradigms. Social pressures discourage deviation from consensus. Admitting major errors threatens institutional credibility. So errors get revised gradually, quietly, in ways that allow everyone to save face. The parallel to Terra Australis' slow shrinking from maps is almost exact. Each new edition of nutritional guidelines adjusts previous recommendations without quite admitting they were wrong. Each revision to economic models adds complexity rather than acknowledging fundamental flaws. Each update to psychological findings refines rather than contradicts what came before. This doesn't mean all knowledge is equally uncertain or that truth is impossible to achieve. Terra Australis really didn't exist, and discovering that was progress. Antarctica really does exist, and mapping it accurately was an achievement. The point is about process, not outcome. About recognizing that our systems for creating knowledge can, under certain conditions, manufacture and maintain false certainties. What we're certain about today includes things that are true and things that future generations will find as baffling as we find Terra Australis. The difficulty is knowing which is which. The cartographers who drew the phantom continent weren't trying to deceive anyone. They were working within systems that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others, using the best methods available, following professional standards that seemed reasonable at the time. We're doing the same. In some domains, our maps are accurate. In others, we're drawing continents that don't exist. The question is, which ones? Understanding how Terra Australis was created and eventually erased gives us a framework for evaluating modern knowledge claims. But there's one more dimension to explore. What can we learn from the people who got it wrong? What did the cartographers, explorers, and scholars of the past do right, even as they drew continents that didn't exist? There's a strange paradox at the heart of the Terra Australis story. The continent didn't exist, but the search for it created more accurate knowledge of the southern hemisphere than might have been achieved otherwise. The error was productive in ways that truth alone might not have been. Consider James Cook's second voyage. His explicit mission was to find Terra Australis, or prove conclusively that it didn't exist. Without that goal, would the British Admiralty have funded such an ambitious expedition? Would Cook have pushed so far south, into waters so dangerous that earlier explorers had turned back? Would he have spent 3 years methodically charting latitudes where the phantom continent supposedly began? The answer is probably not. Exploration required motivation, and motivation required a goal more concrete than simple curiosity. Terra Australis provided that goal. It was specific enough to plan for, valuable enough to justify the expense, definite enough to guide navigation decisions. Cook sailed toward something, even though that something turned out to be nothing. But in the process of searching, he mapped coastlines, catalogued islands, recorded ocean currents, and collected scientific observations that would have been impossible without the phantom continent as an organizing purpose. This pattern repeats throughout the history of geographical exploration. The Dutch wouldn't have surveyed the Western Australian coast so thoroughly if they hadn't believed they were mapping the northern edge of Terra Australis. French expeditions to the South Pacific were motivated partly by the hope of claiming the legendary continent before the British did. Spanish voyages pushed into southern waters specifically to verify or disprove reports of the southern land. Each expedition, regardless of whether it found what it sought, added to the growing body of accurate geographical knowledge. The philosopher Karl Popper argued that the mark of a good scientific hypothesis isn't whether it's true, but whether it's falsifiable, whether it makes specific predictions that could potentially be proven wrong. Terra Australis was eminently falsifiable. It should exist at specific latitudes. It should have coastlines visible from ships. It should show up when you sailed to where the map said it was. This falsifiability made it scientifically valuable despite being false. It drove investigation that could prove or disprove the claim, which is exactly what good hypotheses should do. Contrast this with later lost continent myths like Atlantis. These evolved to be unfalsifiable whenever one location was ruled out. Believers simply moved the continent somewhere else. No amount of evidence could disprove them because they were designed, consciously or unconsciously, to be immune to evidence. Such myths can't drive productive research because there's no way to test them, no clear criteria for success or failure. Terra Australis was different. It was wrong, but it was wrong in a way that could be discovered and corrected. The process of discovering that wrongness generated knowledge that wouldn't have existed otherwise. There's something else worth acknowledging. The maps showing Terra Australis are beautiful objects. Look at them in museums or archives, and you see craftsmanship, artistry, human ambition made visible in ink and gold leaf. They represent hope, the hope that the world contained undiscovered wonders, that human knowledge could expand, that the future held mysteries worth pursuing. When maps became purely accurate, stripped of speculation and imagination, they gained utility but lost something aesthetically and psychologically valuable. They became tools rather than inspirations. This isn't an argument for deliberate falsehood. Accuracy matters. Navigation requires truth. But it is an argument for recognizing that the path to truth isn't always direct, that errors can be productive when they're the right kind of errors, that being wrong in specific ways sometimes teaches more than being vaguely right. The search for Terra Australis was an era that advanced human knowledge, not despite being wrong, but in some ways because of it. The continent didn't exist, but the search for it created something valuable nonetheless. The belief in Terra Australis drove exploration, but it also did something else. It demanded rigorous methods for testing claims. The process of trying to find the continent, failing, and eventually accepting its non-existence helped establish the modern scientific approach to geography. Before Terra Australis, geography was largely a theoretical discipline. Scholars worked from texts, copying and commenting on Ptolemy, debating interpretations of ancient authorities, reasoning from first principles about how the world should be structured. Direct observation mattered, but it mattered less than philosophical coherence and respect for established wisdom. The search for the southern continent changed this. It created a crisis that demanded resolution through observation rather than argument. Either the continent existed, or it didn't. Either ships could sail to it and confirm its presence, or they would sail through empty ocean and prove its absence. Theory alone couldn't settle the question. Only empirical investigation could. This forced geographers to develop more rigorous standards for evidence. It was no longer acceptable to draw coastlines based solely on ancient predictions or theoretical necessity. You needed coordinates from actual voyages. You needed multiple independent confirmations. You needed observations made with reliable instruments by credible observers. The standard of proof rose dramatically because the stakes were so high. Billions in potential trade, national prestige, territorial claims that could reshape global politics. The search for Terra Australis drove specific technical innovations. The problem of determining longitude became urgent in a way it hadn't been before. If explorers couldn't calculate their east-west position precisely, they might sail past the continent without realizing it, or they might report seeing it at locations where it didn't actually exist. The British government eventually offered a prize of £20,000, an enormous sum for a practical method of determining longitude at sea. The chronometers that won that prize were tested and refined during voyages, searching for the southern continent. Techniques for measuring latitude improved as well. More accurate sextants, better tables of astronomical data, standardized procedures for taking and verifying measurements. When you're trying to determine whether land exists at a specific parallel, precision matters. A degree of error could mean the difference between confirming and refuting the continent's existence. Systematic surveying methods emerged from this period. Rather than sporadic observations recorded haphazardly, expeditions began following protocols, regular measurements at defined intervals, consistent notation systems, cross-checking between multiple observers. The need to produce maps that other nations would accept as definitive pushed cartographers toward greater methodological rigor. Perhaps most importantly, the Terra Australis debate established new standards for verifying explorer reports. Early accounts from sailors who claimed to have seen the continent were accepted at face value, treated as reliable simply because the observer seemed credible. But as contradictory reports accumulated, geographers developed more skeptical procedures. They cross-referenced claims against known navigation routes. They looked for internal consistency in journals. They demanded corroborating evidence from multiple sources. They distinguished between what explorers actually observed and what they inferred or assumed. This shift represented something profound, the move from authority-based knowledge to evidence-based knowledge. What mattered was no longer who said something or how long it had been believed, but whether it could be empirically verified. Ancient texts were valuable as starting points, but couldn't override direct observation. Prestigious scholars commanded respect, but their claims still needed testing. Theory guided investigation, but didn't predetermine conclusions. Terra Australis became a test case for this new epistemology. Could philosophical reasoning about planetary balance override reports from sailors who'd sailed where the continent should be and found nothing? For a while, the answer was yes, theory trumped observation. But eventually, as evidence accumulated and methods improved, the answer shifted. Empirical investigation won out over theoretical necessity. This wasn't an easy or quick transition. Authority-based and evidence-based approaches to knowledge coexisted uncomfortably for decades. Individual geographers had to choose which they valued more, the weight of tradition or the reliability of systematic observation. Institutions had to decide whether maintaining consistency with past claims mattered more than accuracy in current maps. Eventually, empirical methods prevailed. Geography became a science in the modern sense, systematic, evidence-based, willing to revise claims based on new observations. Terra Australis's greatest legacy isn't the continent that never existed. It's the methodological revolution that proving its non-existence required. But methodology and rigor weren't the only legacies. The Terra Australis era also established something crucial for modern society: the idea that expert consensus can be wrong, and that ordinary observation can overturn established authority. This was a radical notion in the 1700s. It still is today. For 200 years, the most educated people in Europe believed Terra Australis existed. Not peasants repeating folklore, but scholars, royal geographers, university professors, the intellectual elite who shaped policy and advised kings. They had good reasons for their belief. Ancient authorities supported it. Mathematical reasoning suggested it. Multiple explorers claimed to have seen it. By all the standards that established truth in their society, the southern continent was real. And then, a handful of sailors said it wasn't. Men who worked with their hands, who read the stars not from books but from necessity, who knew the ocean through direct experience rather than theoretical study. Men without university degrees or royal appointments. Men who were, in the social hierarchy of the time, decidedly beneath the scholars who claimed authority over geographical knowledge. The sailors were right. The scholars were wrong. This should be a simple story of truth prevailing over error, but it's more complicated than that, because the sailors initially weren't believed. Their observations were dismissed as mistakes, their navigational calculations questioned, their competence doubted. The establishment had too much invested in the consensus, professional reputations, published works, institutional authority, to accept contradiction from sources they considered inferior. What eventually forced the issue wasn't just evidence, but accumulated evidence delivered by someone the establishment couldn't easily dismiss. Cook succeeded where earlier doubters failed, partly because he had the credentials, the institutional backing, the social position that made challenging him harder than accepting what he reported. Truth needed power to be heard. This reveals something both hopeful and troubling about how societies determine what's true. On one hand, the Terra Australis story demonstrates that knowledge doesn't only flow from elite institutions downward. People engaged in practical work, making direct observations, can recognize truths that theoreticians miss. The sailor who reports that land isn't where the map says it should be deserves to be heard, regardless of whether they understand the philosophical arguments that put it there. On the other hand, being right isn't always enough. You also need credibility, authority, social position. The explorers who first questioned Terra Australis were dismissed not because their evidence was weak, but because they lacked the institutional power to demand serious consideration. This pattern repeats throughout history. Correct claims rejected because the source lacks prestige. False claims accepted because the source has authority. The solution isn't to reject expertise or treat all claims as equally valid. That way leads to chaos, where no one can distinguish truth from falsehood. But neither can we simply defer to authority without question. The establishment is sometimes wrong, and recognizing those errors often requires listening to voices from outside the mainstream. The key distinction lies in methodology. The explorers who disproved Terra Australis weren't rejecting evidence-based reasoning. They were demanding more rigorous evidence than the scholarly establishment was providing. They said, "Don't tell me the continent exists because ancient Greeks predicted it or because other explorers claimed to see it. Show me coordinates, show me systematic observations, show me something I can independently verify." That demand for transparent methods, replicable observations, evidence that can be checked rather than authority that must be trusted, is what distinguishes productive skepticism from mere cynicism. It's what allows knowledge to be democratically accessible while still maintaining standards. Terra Australis taught that expert consensus can be wrong, but it also taught that overturning false consensus requires better evidence, not just contrary opinion. The sailors who proved the continent didn't exist won because they had rigorous observations, not because they shouted loud enough. The Terra Australis story teaches us about knowledge, error, and authority. But it also teaches something about the human spirit, about our need to explore, to discover, to push beyond the known. Even when we're wrong, even when we're searching for things that don't exist, that search itself can lead somewhere valuable. There's a moment in Abel Tasman's journal, written somewhere in the grey waters south of Java, that reveals something essential about why humans explore. He's been at sea for weeks, following maps toward a continent he's never seen. The supplies are adequate but monotonous. The crew is restless. The ocean looks the same in every direction. And he writes, almost as an aside, that he feels more alive in these empty waters than he ever felt in Amsterdam. This is the part that maps can't show. The obvious motivation for exploring Terra Australis was commercial spices, gold, trade routes, territorial claims. The merchants who funded expeditions cared about profit. The kings who authorized voyages cared about empire. But the men who actually went, who spent years on wooden ships facing storms and disease and the real possibility of never returning, their motivations were often more complicated, more personal, harder to articulate. Read enough explorer journals, and a pattern emerges. They write about the discovery objectives, yes, but they also write about the strange freedom of being beyond the edge of the known world. About the way time feels different when you're somewhere no map has marked. About the psychological space that opens up when you've left behind everything familiar and haven't yet arrived anywhere new. The frontier, whether it's a geographical frontier like Terra Australis or any other kind, represents possibility in its purest form. At home, your life has a shape already. You have a reputation, a social position, a history of choices that constrain future choices. You're embedded in a web of expectations and obligations. The person you've been limits who you can become. But out there, beyond the horizon, none of that necessarily applies. You could be anyone. You could discover something that changes everything. You could fail spectacularly or succeed beyond imagination. And either way, you'd have a story that justifies the attempt. The frontier doesn't care who your father was or what mistakes you made in your youth. It evaluates you only by what you do in the present moment, with whatever skills and courage you can muster. This is why people chase things that might not exist. Not always because they're convinced of the reality of what they're pursuing, but because the pursuit itself offers something valuable. Structure, purpose, a narrative that gives life meaning. You're the protagonist of a discovery story, facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, moving toward a goal that matters. Terra Australis provided that narrative structure for hundreds of men across multiple generations. It gave them a reason to endure hardship, to push beyond comfort, to test themselves against conditions that would reveal whether they had the qualities they hoped they possessed. Whether the continent existed became almost secondary to the act of searching for it. There's a cognitive dimension too. The human mind finds incompleteness deeply uncomfortable. We're pattern recognition machines, constantly trying to make sense of limited information, filling gaps in our knowledge with educated guesses or pure speculation. A map with blank spaces feels wrong. A world where vast regions remain unknown feels like a puzzle missing pieces. This drive to complete knowledge isn't always rational. Sometimes the blank space is more valuable than whatever fills it. Sometimes not knowing preserves possibilities that knowing would eliminate. But the urge remains to explore, to discover, to fill in the missing pieces until the picture is complete. We're still doing this, just with different frontiers. We pursue career goals that might not lead where we imagine. We search for perfect relationships that may not exist in the form we envision. We chase political visions, spiritual enlightenment, technological breakthroughs, personal transformation. Some of these pursuits lead somewhere real. Others turn out to be phantoms, Terra Australises of our modern age, things we needed to believe in for a while, even if they weren't quite real. The impulse that sent ships south searching for a continent that didn't exist is the same impulse that drives people to attempt anything difficult with an uncertain outcome. We're searching for something, and sometimes what we're really searching for isn't the stated goal, but the transformation that occurs during the search itself. Terra Australis was just the excuse. The real discovery was what exploration revealed about the explorers themselves, their capacity for endurance, their ability to function in the face of uncertainty, their willingness to pursue knowledge even at enormous personal cost. But there's a tension in exploration. The moment you find what you're searching for, it ceases to be mysterious. The unknown becomes known, possibility becomes fact, and something precious is lost. This is the explorer's paradox, and Terra Australis illustrates it perfectly. James Cook returned to England in 1775 with news that should have been celebrated as a triumph of human knowledge. He'd settled a question that had occupied the greatest minds for 2,000 years. He'd mapped the Southern Ocean with unprecedented accuracy. He'd pushed the boundaries of human exploration further than anyone before him. But his conclusion carried a melancholic weight that no one quite acknowledged. The southern continent, as imagined, did not exist. And with that definitive answer, something vanished that was more valuable than most people realized. Before Cook's voyage, Terra Australis could have been anything. The maps showed a vast landmass, but the details were speculation. It could have been a paradise of gentle climate and abundant resources. It could have harbored civilizations unknown to European knowledge. It could have contained plants and animals that would revolutionize science, geography that would reshape global trade, knowledge that would alter human understanding. Every possibility remained open because the question remained unanswered. After Cook's voyage, the possibilities collapsed into a single reality. There was no temperate continent, only ice, only frozen wasteland beyond where ships could safely sail. The question was answered, which meant the dream was over. This is the strange tragedy of knowledge. Every question answered narrows the space of what might be true. Every mystery solved eliminates all the beautiful theories that turned out to be wrong. Every certainty closes doors that uncertainty kept open. We gain truth, which is valuable, necessary, worth pursuing, but we lose possibility, which is valuable in different ways. The phenomenon isn't limited to geographical exploration. It operates in every domain of human experience. You spend years dreaming about visiting a place, Paris, perhaps, or Kyoto, or some small village your family came from generations ago. The imagined version contains infinite potential. It's perfect in ways real places can't be, because your imagination fills in details without the constraints of reality. Then you visit. The place is real, specific, limited by the facts of its actual existence. It might be wonderful, it might exceed expectations in some ways, but it can never match the infinite possibility that existed when it remained unvisited. Relationships follow similar patterns. The early stages, when the other person remains partially unknown, carry a mystery that makes everything feel charged with potential. You don't know yet how the story will unfold. The relationship could become anything. As time passes and you learn more, the mystery resolves into specific reality. The relationship becomes defined, particular, limited by what it actually is rather than what it might have been. This isn't necessarily bad. Real intimacy requires knowledge, but something is genuinely lost in the transition from mystery to familiarity. The sociologist Max Weber called this broader pattern disenchantment. As science explains, phenomena that were once mysterious, the world becomes more predictable, more calculable, but somehow less magical. We know that thunder is atmospheric discharge rather than the anger of gods. We know that diseases are caused by microorganisms rather than curses or moral failings. We know that stars are distant suns rather than lights hung on the vault of heaven. Each explanation is correct, but correctness comes at a price. Terra Australis, before it was disproven, held a kind of magic. It was the last great geographical mystery, the final blank space where anything might exist. Erasing it from maps was progress. Ships could navigate more safely, resources could be allocated more efficiently, knowledge became more accurate. But the world also became smaller, more completely known, less full of wonder. This isn't an argument for ignorance. We needed to know the truth about the southern hemisphere. Cook's voyage was a triumph of human courage and scientific rigor. But it's worth acknowledging what was lost in that triumph, the freedom to imagine possibilities that reality ultimately foreclosed. But perhaps this melancholy is premature, because while Terra Australis disappeared from maps, the human need for mystery didn't disappear, it just relocated. Where do we find mystery now? In an age when satellites have mapped every square kilometre of Earth's surface. The age of geographical exploration ended, but mystery didn't. It just changed location, moved deeper, higher, further, inward. Found new blank spaces that cartography can't fill and satellites can't photograph. Consider the ocean. We've mapped every coastline, charted every shipping route, photographed the surface from space with resolution high enough to see individual waves. But 95% of the ocean floor has never been seen by human eyes. It remains as unknown to us as Terra Australis was to Renaissance Europeans. More unknown, in some ways, because at least they could sail to where they thought it existed. We can't easily reach the deepest trenches, where pressure would crush our vessels, where darkness is absolute, where creatures live that have never encountered light. Every year, scientists discover species we didn't know existed, not just microorganisms, but fish, mammals, whole ecosystems functioning in ways that challenge our understanding of what life requires. The mystery didn't end. We just learned it was in the depths rather than across the horizon. Then there's space. Terra Australis occupied perhaps a few million square miles on theoretical maps. Space is effectively infinite. Every star we can see might have planets. Every planet might have conditions we've never imagined. The distances are so vast that exploration in the traditional sense becomes almost meaningless. We can see distant galaxies but will never reach them, can detect planets but will never walk their surfaces. The frontier opened wider than any Renaissance explorer could have conceived. Mystery moved inward as well as outward. We still don't understand consciousness, how subjective experience arises from physical matter, why there's something it feels like to be you, rather than just processing occurring without awareness. We can map every neuron in a brain, trace every chemical signal, model every electrical pulse, and still not explain why any of this creates the felt sense of being alive, of experiencing colours and emotions and thoughts. The quantum realm offers mysteries that make Terra Australis look straightforward. Particles that exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. Effects that seem to propagate faster than light. Reality that appears fundamentally uncertain at its deepest levels. The more precisely we map this territory, the stranger it becomes. Even human potential remains largely unexplored. We don't know the limits of what humans can achieve, learn, create, become. Every generation pushes boundaries we thought were fixed. Every decade reveals capacities we didn't know we possessed. The frontier here isn't geographical, but psychological and creative, and it might be genuinely limitless. In some ways, we know less now than we did in 1700, not because we've forgotten things, but because we're aware of how much we don't know. The Renaissance cartographers thought they understood the world's basic geography. They just needed to fill in details. We know that our understanding of reality is incomplete in fundamental ways, that we're missing huge pieces of the picture, that questions we can't even properly formulate might have answers that would transform everything. Terra Australis was a finite mystery. You could sail there and settle the question. Modern mysteries are different. They recede as we approach them. Every answer reveals new questions at a deeper level. The horizon keeps moving. The human spirit that sent ships toward an imaginary continent is still alive, still exploring, still pushing into the unknown. We haven't lost our capacity for wonder or our drive to discover. We've just redirected these impulses toward frontiers that can't be reached by wooden ships or drawn on parchment maps. The blank spaces on our maps aren't geographical anymore. They're conceptual, theoretical, interior. But they serve the same psychological function that Terra Australis once served. They remind us that the world isn't completely known, that mystery still exists, that possibility remains open. The frontier didn't close. It just moved, and it's bigger now than it ever was. But the story of Terra Australis isn't finished. Because while the continent itself vanished from maps, its influence continues in unexpected ways, shaping how nations draw borders, how lawyers argue cases, and how the world is organized today. In 1642, Spanish and Dutch diplomats nearly came to blows over a question of sovereignty. Not over territory either, nation actually controlled, not over land anyone had ever walked upon, but over theoretical claims to portions of Terra Australis. Spain argued that the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, gave them rights to the southern continent's eastern regions. The Dutch countered that their explorers had sailed closer to the western coast, establishing prior discovery. Both sides produced maps as evidence. Neither side could prove the land they were arguing over actually existed. This wasn't a minor diplomatic squabble. These were serious negotiations involving lawyers, scholars, and officials at the highest levels of government. They drew boundaries through empty ocean, debated which nation had discovered which imaginary coastline first, crafted legal arguments about sovereignty over a phantom. And these arguments weren't purely theoretical. They had real implications for future colonial policy, trade rights, and potential military action. The legal framework that made this possible was based on a principle called discovery doctrine. In European international law of the time, discovering land being the first European to see and claim it established ownership rights, even if you never returned, never established a settlement, never exerted any actual control. The map itself served as legal proof. If a nation could point to a map showing their explorer had charted a coastline, that constituted a valid territorial claim. This created a strange situation where cartographic fiction had legal force. Nations claimed ownership of Terra Australis based on maps that showed it existed, even though no one could prove anyone had actually reached it. The claims were treated as legitimate until someone could prove them illegitimate, which was nearly impossible when the territory in question was thousands of miles away, across dangerous ocean. The absurdity becomes clear only in retrospect. At the time, within the legal and epistemological framework Europeans operated under, it made sense. Maps were authoritative documents produced by credible experts. If multiple maps showed a continent, that seemed like sufficient evidence to base legal claims upon. The system didn't require that you actually possess land to claim sovereignty. It only required that you assert claim based on discovery, and discovery could be proven through cartographic documentation. Here's where it gets genuinely consequential. When real lands were eventually discovered in the southern hemisphere, these prior theoretical claims were sometimes invoked to justify colonization. When the Dutch encountered Australia, they argued they'd already established claim to Terra Australis in that region. Therefore, this newly confirmed land fell under their existing sovereignty. When Britain later disputed this, both sides referenced historical maps showing the phantom continent, using those fictions to support real territorial ambitions. The imaginary borders drawn through Terra Australis influenced actual colonial borders decades later. Arguments about where Spain's claim ended and Portugal's began, originally debated in reference to a continent that didn't exist, were later applied to Pacific islands and Australian territories that did exist. The legal precedents established while arguing about nothing became applicable when there was actually something to argue about. This pattern reveals something profound about how power operates through documentation. Maps don't just represent territory, they create claims to territory. Legal fictions, if accepted by enough authorities, generate real consequences. The phantom continent may have been imaginary, but the sovereignty disputes around it were concrete, shaping colonial policy and international law in ways that persisted long after everyone agreed the continent was fictitious. Modern international law has evolved to reduce these dynamics. Pure discovery claims are less accepted now. Territorial sovereignty generally requires actual occupation, effective administration, recognition by other states. The era when you could claim land simply by drawing it on a map and sailing vaguely in that direction has largely ended. But the underlying logic hasn't disappeared entirely. Nations still assert sovereignty based on historical documents, maps, and claim discoveries that may be questionable. They still draw boundaries through regions they don't actually control, still reference centuries-old precedents to justify contemporary claims. The specific mechanisms have changed, become more sophisticated, require more evidence. But the basic pattern using documents and historical claims to establish sovereignty over territories you don't physically possess remains recognizable. The legal legacy of Terra Australis shaped colonial borders, but there's another legacy one that's even more relevant today. The Phantom Continent helped establish the principle that you can claim ownership over places you've never actually controlled. And that principle is very much alive in the 21st century. Look at a map of the South China Sea, and you'll see something familiar. A boundary drawn across water, not along coastlines or between islands, but through open ocean, creating a vast claimed territory that encompasses areas hundreds of miles from any Chinese shore. The justification for this 9-dash line includes reference to ancient Chinese maps, showing these waters as historically Chinese. The problem is that cartographic accuracy in those ancient maps is questionable. The historical claims are disputed, and the line itself appeared on maps only in the 1,940 seconds, defining boundaries that China had never actually controlled. It's Terra Australis logic operating in modern form. Historical maps used to justify present claims, sovereignty asserted based on documentation rather than administration, boundaries drawn through regions where actual presence is minimal or contested. The technology has improved. Satellites verify that the islands and reefs actually exist, but the underlying pattern remains. Maps as tools for creating, rather than merely representing territorial rights. Antarctica presents another version of the same dynamic. 7 nations maintain territorial claims to sectors of the continent, drawn as neat wedges radiating from the South Pole like slices of a pie. These claims are based on historical exploration. This expedition reached here in 1908. That team planted a flag there in 1929. The Antarctic Treaty System, established in 1961, froze these claims without resolving them. Nations maintain their assertions of sovereignty while agreeing not to enforce them. It's a holding pattern where everyone agrees to disagree, where theoretical claims persist indefinitely without being tested through actual governance. The claims themselves follow the Terra Australis pattern perfectly. Nations assert ownership over vast regions of ice, where they maintain only minimal presence, perhaps a research station, perhaps nothing at all. The sovereignty is theoretical, proven by historical documents and maps rather than effective administration. If the treaty system ever collapses, these paper claims will presumably become the basis for real disputes. The Arctic is following a similar trajectory as climate change opens new possibilities for resource extraction and shipping. Nations with Arctic coastlines are extending territorial claims based on continental shelf arguments, essentially claiming that underwater geological formations entitle them to sovereignty over water and ice that no one permanently occupies. The logic is more sophisticated than simple discovery doctrine, involving geological surveys and international maritime law, but it's fundamentally the same process, using maps and technical documentation to establish ownership claims over regions you don't actually control. Even space follows this pattern. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits national sovereignty claims over celestial bodies, but corporations and nations are already arguing about rights to lunar resources, asteroid mining, Martian colonization. They're drawing boundaries and establishing claims based on theoretical future presence, on plans and proposals rather than actual occupation. We're potentially recreating the Terra Australis dynamic off-planet, claiming ownership of places based on maps and documentation before anyone has actually been there. The differences from the Terra Australis era matter, though. Modern international law places more weight on effective occupation and administration than pure discovery or historical claims. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea tries to establish clear criteria for maritime boundaries rather than allowing claims based solely on ancient maps. International institutions provide forums for disputing questionable assertions rather than simply accepting whatever the most powerful nation claims. But historical claims still carry weight. Past maps still influence present boundaries. Documents from centuries ago are still cited in contemporary legal arguments. The notion that you can establish ownership through cartographic assertion, through documentation and historical precedent rather than actual control, hasn't been fully eliminated. It's been constrained, made more complex, subjected to more rigorous standards of evidence, but it persists. Terra Australis taught us that maps can create reality as well as represent it, that documenting something can be the first step toward making it real, that legal fictions have material consequences. These lessons remain operative in modern geopolitics. The phantom continent disappeared from maps, but the logic that put it there never entirely went away. It just became more sophisticated, more carefully justified, more embedded in international legal frameworks that disguise but don't eliminate its essential nature. Nations in 2025 are still arguing over territories they don't fully control, still drawing boundaries through contested spaces, still using historical documents and maps as evidence of sovereignty. The technology is better, the legal frameworks are more developed, but the fundamental pattern would be recognizable to any Spanish diplomat arguing over Terra Australis in 1642. But the phantom continent's influence extends beyond geopolitics. It also changed how we think about exploration itself, creating expectations and templates that still shape modern discovery missions from ocean exploration to space travel. When NASA announces a Mars mission, the structure follows a pattern established 400 years ago. There's government funding secured through political processes, with budgets debated and justified based on national interest and prestige. There are scientific institutions, universities, research centers providing expertise and planning. There are carefully selected explorers, undergoing rigorous training, becoming public figures, embodying national hopes. There's a dramatic departure, a dangerous journey through hostile environment, challenges overcome through skill and courage. Then return or communication from the distant location bringing back data, samples, knowledge, public celebration, scientific papers. The findings incorporated into official understanding of the world. This is the exact template refined during the search for Terra Australis. Cook's voyages followed this structure. So did every major expedition before and after him. It's so deeply embedded in how we conceive of exploration that it feels natural, inevitable, like the only way such endeavors could possibly be organized. But it's not. It's a specific cultural construct, developed in a particular historical context, serving particular purposes. The template emphasizes individual heroism. Cook is remembered as the man who disproved Terra Australis, though he commanded crews of dozens, relied on instrument makers and cartographers who never left London, built on knowledge accumulated by hundreds of earlier explorers. The narrative structure focuses on the heroic individual, the captain, the astronaut, the expedition leader, because that makes a compelling story and because it serves political purposes. Nations can rally around heroes. Heroes can be honored, celebrated, used to inspire future generations. This template also structures exploration as quest, narrative, departure from home, journey through dangerous territory, achievement or failure, return transformed. It's the oldest story structure humans have, appearing in myths and legends across every culture. Applying it to geographical exploration makes those endeavors emotionally resonant, turns them into stories worth telling and remembering. But it also distorts how exploration actually works, which is often less dramatic and more incremental than the heroic narrative suggests. The template connects exploration to national purpose in specific ways. Expeditions represent their home countries, plant flags, make claims in the name of sovereigns. The knowledge they produce serves national interests, strategic, commercial, political. This seems natural because that's how exploration has been funded and organized since the Renaissance. But it's possible to imagine different models of exploration as collective human endeavor rather than national competition. Discoveries understood as shared heritage rather than national achievement. Modern scientific research sometimes transcends this template. Climate science involves international collaboration, with data shared freely and findings understood as global rather than national. The International Space Station represents a partially successful attempt to organize exploration outside the national competition framework. But even these efforts struggle against the gravitational pull of the Terra Australis template. Funding still comes from national governments. Prestige still accrues to individual nations. The narrative structure still emphasizes heroic achievement rather than collective patient work. When billionaires fund private exploration, whether of the deep ocean, remote wildernesses, or space, they're replicating the same template with slightly different actors. Instead of kings and governments, wealthy individuals provide patronage. Instead of national prestige, corporate branding. But the structure remains. Wealthy patron, heroic explorer, dangerous journey, triumphant return, incorporation of discoveries into official knowledge. This isn't necessarily bad. The template works. It motivates people, secures funding, produces results. but recognizing it as a specific cultural construct rather than the natural form of exploration opens possibilities for thinking differently. We could organize discovery as truly collective enterprise. We could structure narratives that emphasize cooperation over competition, patience over drama, incremental understanding over heroic revelation. The challenges we face now, climate change, pandemic disease, ecosystem collapse, require exploration and discovery, but might be better served by different templates. These aren't problems that heroic individuals can solve through dramatic expeditions. They require sustained collective effort, international cooperation, patient accumulation of knowledge across decades. The Terra Australis template doesn't fit these needs perfectly. Understanding how that template emerged, recognizing its influence on how we think about exploration and discovery, is the first step toward imagining alternatives. The Phantom Continent shaped not just maps, but the entire cultural framework we use to organize our relationship with the unknown. Understanding Terra Australis's legacy, legal, political, cultural, shows that historical errors don't simply disappear when corrected. They leave traces, influence institutions, shape expectations. Which brings us to the final question. What should we do with this knowledge? How should the story of Terra Australis change how we think and act today? For 200 years, the smartest people in Europe believed Terra Australis existed. Not fools, not the ignorant. The finest minds of their age, astronomers who could predict eclipses, mathematicians who understood geometry well enough to calculate the Earth's circumference, navigators who could sail across thousands of miles of ocean and arrive within a few miles of their intended destination. They had reasons for their belief. Good reasons, based on the best information and theories available. Ancient authorities supported it. Mathematical logic suggested it. Multiple explorers reported seeing it. They were completely, utterly wrong. If that doesn't humble you, if you're not wondering what you're completely, utterly wrong about right now, you haven't understood the story. Because the mechanisms that created Terra Australis, confirmation bias, social proof, institutional inertia, the gap between theory and observation, are still operating. In your mind, in your profession, in the consensus realities you inhabit and help create. The lesson isn't relativism. Terra Australis really didn't exist. Antarctica really does. Some beliefs correspond to reality and others don't, and the difference matters enormously. But the lesson is humility about how we arrive at beliefs, how confident we should be in them, how quickly we should update when evidence changes. Hold beliefs with confidence proportional to evidence quality, not to authority or consensus. The cartographers who drew Terra Australis had consensus on their side. They had authority, royal geographers, prestigious universities, centuries of accumulated scholarship. What they didn't have was direct observation that could be independently verified. When those things came into conflict, observation should win. Usually it doesn't, at least not immediately, but it should. Distinguish between different types of uncertainty. Some things we don't know yet, but could discover through investigation. Terra Australis fell into this category, sail south and look. Other things are fundamentally unknowable, at least with current methods. Some questions don't have answers we can access. Confusing these categories leads to wasted effort and false confidence. Know which kind of uncertainty you're dealing with. Understand that knowledge is socially constructed, but reality is not. The maps were human creations, products of specific historical circumstances, influenced by incentives and biases and the limitations of available information. They could be wrong, and were wrong. But the actual geography of the southern hemisphere existed independent of human maps. Coastlines didn't care what cartographers drew. This distinction matters. It means criticism of how we create knowledge isn't an attack on the possibility of truth. It's an attempt to create better alignment between our maps and the territories they claim to represent. Recognize that being wrong isn't shameful. Every human who ever lived has been wrong about important things. Wrong is the default state. What's shameful is refusing to update when evidence accumulates, protecting false beliefs because admitting error feels uncomfortable, doubling down on claims that reality contradicts. The cartographers who slowly shrank Terra Australis on their maps, who allowed it to fade gradually, rather than defending it to the end, they weren't being dishonest. They were doing the hard work of revising worldviews, which is never easy, and rarely happens cleanly. Appreciate that we often need to act on incomplete information, but do so with appropriate humility. The explorers searching for Terra Australis couldn't wait for perfect knowledge before setting sail. They made decisions based on the best information available, knowing it was incomplete, hoping it was accurate enough. We do this constantly in careers, relationships, politics, investments. The question isn't whether to act under uncertainty, which is unavoidable, but how to hold uncertainty consciously, how to remain open to correction, how to structure decisions so they can be adjusted when more information arrives. These aren't just abstract principles. They're practices that make the difference between knowledge systems that self-correct and ones that entrench error, between individuals who learn and grow and ones who rigidify around false certainties, between societies that adapt to reality and ones that insist reality conform to their maps. The Terra Australis story is fundamentally hopeful despite being a story of error, because the error was discovered and corrected. The process took too long, cost too much, caused suffering for explorers who searched in vain. But it happened. Humanity got it wrong, then eventually got it right. The system self-corrected. We're capable of that. Of believing confidently, then discovering we were wrong, then updating. Of building knowledge systems that value truth over comfort, evidence over authority, humility over certainty. The question is whether we choose to do the work required. These lessons apply to individuals, but they also apply to society as a whole. How should institutions, governments, universities, media, corporations handle uncertainty? How should we structure knowledge systems to minimize Terra Australis-type errors while still enabling discovery? What if Renaissance cartographers had been rewarded for finding and removing errors from maps rather than for adding impressive new details? What if admitting, "I don't know," about the southern hemisphere had been seen as honest professionalism rather than ignorance? What if the institutions that created and certified maps had built-in mechanisms for challenging consensus? Terra Australis persisted partly because the incentive structures made it persist. Cartographers built reputations by producing complete, confident maps. Explorers secured funding by claiming to have seen what investors wanted to exist. Institutions protected authority by defending claims their predecessors had made. No one was conspiring to deceive anyone. They were responding rationally to the incentives they faced, which suggests that different incentives might produce different outcomes. Better maps, in both the literal and metaphorical sense. First principle: reward error correction as much as discovery. In modern science, publishing a paper that identifies flaws in previous research is often seen as less valuable than publishing original findings. But error correction is crucial. It's how knowledge improves. If institutions celebrated researchers who proved their own theories wrong, who identified mistakes in widely accepted models, who had the courage to say, "We got this wrong, and here's why," the rate of self-correction would increase dramatically. Some fields are experimenting with this. Journals that publish null results, studies that didn't find what they expected to find. Replication projects that test whether famous findings hold up. These are small steps toward incentivizing correction over merely incentivizing new claims. Second principle: structure descent into knowledge systems. Every organization should have roles specifically tasked with challenging consensus. Red teams in military planning, whose job is to find flaws in proposed strategies. Devil's advocates in decision-making processes, required to argue against prevailing opinion regardless of their personal view. These positions need real power and protection. They can't be mere theatre, token skepticism that gets ignored when it's inconvenient. The Royal Society dismissed the navigator who questioned Terra Australis, partly because there was no institutional role for systematic doubt, no structure that forced consideration of uncomfortable evidence. Building that structure doesn't guarantee truth, but it makes error more visible and harder to perpetuate indefinitely. Third principle: distinguish clearly between speculation, hypothesis, and established fact. Renaissance maps drew Terra Australis with the same confidence as Europe. They should have marked it differently: dotted lines, different colors, explicit labels indicating theoretical status. Modern knowledge systems often make similar mistakes, presenting provisional findings as settled facts, blurring lines between "we think this might be true" and "we know this is true." Weather forecasts do this better than many fields. They give probabilities. They show uncertainty explicitly. They update frequently as new information arrives. Other domains could learn from this. Policy proposals could come with explicit uncertainty estimates. Scientific papers could more clearly flag which claims are well established and which are speculative. Maps, literal and metaphorical, could show what's known confidently versus what's inferred tentatively. Fourth principle: create mechanisms for graceful paradigm shifts. The hardest part of correcting Terra Australis wasn't gathering evidence. It was allowing the profession to admit error without mass humiliation. The gradual shrinking of the continent, while frustrating to us looking back, was perhaps necessary. It allowed cartographers to save face while adjusting to reality. Better would be institutions structured to expect regular revision, where updating isn't admission of failure but normal operation, where changing your mind based on evidence is valued rather than seen as weakness. This requires building cultures that separate personal identity from intellectual claims. You're not your theories, so proving them wrong doesn't diminish you. Fifth principle: maintain radical transparency about evidence quality and expert disagreement. When consensus exists, communicate it. When experts disagree, don't hide that disagreement in technical language or present a false unity. The public can handle uncertainty better than institutions often assume. What erodes trust is discovering you were told something was certain when it was actually contested. None of this is easy. These principles go against human nature. We prefer certainty to uncertainty, consensus to conflict, defending claims to revising them. They go against institutional interests. Organizations that admit error risk reputation damage, at least in the short term. Implementing them requires conscious effort, structural changes, cultural shifts that take generations. But it's possible. Some organizations do this well. Some scientific fields have stronger error correction mechanisms than others. Some institutions have built cultures where changing your mind based on evidence is celebrated rather than punished. The examples exist. They can be studied, learned from, adapted to different contexts. Terra Australis suggests these aren't just nice ideas, they're necessary for building knowledge systems that self-correct rather than self-perpetuate errors. The question is whether we have the wisdom to implement them before our own phantom continents lead us too far astray. These institutional reforms matter, but ultimately, Terra Australis is a human story about curiosity, error, stubbornness, and eventual wisdom. It deserves a human conclusion. There's that map again, the one in the Paris archive, the one that started this entire journey. If you could hold it now, feel the weight of the parchment, trace your fingers along the faded ink, you'd understand what you're touching. Not just an error, but a monument. To human ambition and human limitation, to hope and hubris, to the strange courage it takes to believe in something you've never seen. The continent drawn on that map never existed. But the map itself is real, beautiful even. Look at the craftsmanship, the careful lettering, the ornate decorations, the way the unknown coastline curves across the bottom of the world with such confidence. Someone spent months creating this. They believed they were documenting reality, contributing to human knowledge, creating something that would help navigators and merchants and scholars understand their world. They were wrong, but their error was honest. They worked with the information available to them, used the best methods their era possessed, tried to reconcile theory and observation in ways that made sense given what they knew. They were doing their best to map truth. They just didn't have all the pieces yet. Something was lost when Terra Australis disappeared from maps. Not the continent itself that was never real, but the possibility it represented. The sense that the world still held spaces where anything might exist, where human knowledge was incomplete enough that wonder remained justified. When the last cartographer removed the phantom from their charts, the world became smaller in a way that can't be measured in square miles. But something more valuable was gained. The ability to navigate the southern hemisphere accurately, to sail where you intended, rather than where maps falsely promised land. To build knowledge on observation rather than speculation, to see the world as it actually is rather than as theory predicted it should be. The explorers who searched for Terra Australis, their courage was real, even though their goal was imaginary. The years they spent at sea, the dangers they faced, the observations they made, these things mattered. They didn't find what they sought, but they found things worth finding. Australia, New Zealand, Antarctica, the circulation patterns of the Southern Ocean, the limits of where humans could sail with the technology available to them, and perhaps most valuable, Proof that consensus could be wrong, that authority needed verification, that reality mattered more than theory. Their struggles taught us something about ourselves, about how we create knowledge, how we resist updating beliefs, how difficult it is to see clearly when expectation clouds vision, about the social mechanisms that can perpetuate error and the intellectual courage required to correct it, about the very human need for mystery and the equally human need for truth. We're still searching for Terra Australis. In every domain of life, in every field of knowledge, we're pursuing things that may or may not exist in the forms we imagine. Some of these pursuits will succeed, we'll find what we're looking for, or something close enough. Others will fail, we'll discover that what we sought was phantom, that we were mapping our hopes rather than reality. And that's fine. That's how exploration works. That's how knowledge grows. The search itself gives shape to human life, structure, purpose, meaning. We need things to pursue, mysteries to investigate, questions to answer. We need the possibility that beyond what we know might lie something we haven't imagined yet. Terra Australis served that need for 2,000 years, and when it vanished, we found new mysteries to replace it. Terra Australis Incognita, unknown southern land. For 2 millennia, it existed in human imagination. For 2 centuries, it existed on paper. It never existed in reality. But it existed in hope, and hope, unlike continents, is never wasted. Even when it leads to empty ocean instead of promised shores. Even when what we find contradicts what we expected. Even when the search reveals that what we were really seeking was understanding itself rather than any specific destination. The map lies flat now, carefully preserved behind glass, a document from a world that no longer exists. But what it represents, the eternal human project of trying to understand what's real, trying to distinguish truth from hope, trying to navigate between the world as we wish it were and the world as it actually is that continues. That never ends.